and Professor Damle for giving me this opportunity to speak here. And this work was actually done in collaboration with my former students, Anusuya Pati, Swapan Pati, Raghu, Manoranjan Kumar and Sukrit, and my present students, Simil Thomas and Tirthankar Datta. Much of the work was started because of my interactions with Professor Krishnamurthy and Professor Diptiman Sen in the density matrix renormalization group techniques. And of course, the funding comes from DST India, CSIR India, and BRMS India. Well, I would like to dedicate this talk to Professor T.V. Ramakrishnan. He has been my teacher. I was a student in IIT Kanpur during the 70s, and I learned a lot of solid-state physics from him, and I'm ever grateful to him for having taken so much interest in my academics, and I have always been going to him whenever I had problems. And I would like to take this opportunity to wish him many, many more years of happiness, health, and exciting science. So with this, let me go to the topic. The plan of the talk is I will just first, because this is mainly a physics audience, I would like to introduce you to what are conjugated systems and the non-interacting models that were there for the conjugated systems and their limitations, and the interacting models that are used for conjugated systems. Then I'll talk about DMRG method for basically the excited states, a few applications of the DMRG method which are representative, and the dynamic DMRG method for studying time-dependent phenomena using wave packet dynamics. I'll just summarize my talk. Conjugated organic materials are basically organic molecules with extended pi conjugation. Their examples are polymers and large molecules. The polymers like polyacetylene, on which there has been a lot of work since the 70s. Then there is polyparaphenylene vinylene, which is a system which is used in organic light-emitting diodes. And then you have these oligothiophene, oligoacenes, and then biologically important molecules like porphines and phthalocyanines. And the kind of applications that one finds them for these molecules is basically in systems like organic light-emitting diodes, where you have actually now got display systems which are very thin and which are very clear. Then organic photovoltaics, right now it is not yet realization, but you have an efficiency of about 9% using organic materials. And then in organic transistors, which have been not yet in the market, but in the research stage. Well, just to give you examples of conjugated polymers, if it's an organic chemist, then these are the structures you would see. Basically, this is the polyacetylene system, this is the polyparaphenylene system, this is what's called the polyacene systems, and these are the polyparaphenylene vinylene systems. And what is common to all these things is, if you look at the carbon atoms are in sp2 hybridization. So you have a pz orbital, which is one pz orbital at every carbon site, and it's involved in conjugation. So what the very early model for these conjugated systems was the Huckel model, which was in 1930, and it assumes only a transfer integral between bonded carbon sites. And so basically you have a Hamiltonian, which is the single band tight binding model that is written. TIJs are resonance integrals, as the chemists call it, or the transfer integrals as the physicists call it, and the transfers are only between bonded sites, and the alpha i's are either the site energies or the orbital energies, depending upon the school of thought from which you come. Well, if you look at polyacetylene, there are many symmetries in the molecule, in the molecular orbital picture. The symmetries come mainly because the system is basically bipartite. That is, you can actually divide it into two sublattices, and the bond exists only between carbon atoms on one sublattice with carbon atoms on the other sublattice. So this is what the physicists call basically a charge conjugation or electron hole symmetry, and the chemists call them the alternancy symmetry. And the polymer also has an inversion symmetry, and because of weak spin orbit interactions, all the states of the polymers, the electronic states, can be classified by total spin. Of course, the symmetries lead to very strong experimental predictions. So a kind of experimental predictions that the symmetries lead to are what's called the pairing theorem. That is, for every bonding state at an energy minus epsilon k, you have an anti-bonding state at an energy plus epsilon k. That is, the energy levels always occur in pairs, and that's why chemists call it either the pairing theorem or the alternance theorem. And then the symmetry of the states alternate between A and B. So the lowest energy excitation is always dipolar load. So the Pairing theorem also implies something more interesting, that whenever you have an odd number of carbon atoms, then you should have a mid-gap state, because you have paired the states and then one of the states is left out, and that state has to be at zero energy if you must have the validity of the pairing theorem. So if one looks at the energy levels in a molecular orbital picture, you have bonding states and the anti-bonding states, and they're always paired minus epsilon 1 plus epsilon 1, minus epsilon 2 plus epsilon 2, and so forth. And the transition from the highest occupied state to the lowest unoccupied state is dipole allowed. And if you look at an odd polyene, you have a state right in the middle, and that's what people call the solitonic state. And the state excitation from the state here to the state at the mid-gap is also dipole allowed, and so you must be able to see a mid-gap absorption in solidonic systems. So if you go into the polymer limit or the band limit, what it means is that you have an optical gap which is Eg in even polyenes, and then if you go to the odd polyenes, you have an optical gap which is Eg by 2, and this optical gap Eg by 2 is what people call the soliton, and is associated with the kink in the bond order alternation pattern. So we have all the double bonds to the left in before the kink, and all the double bonds to the right after the kink. What is the experimental status? The experimental status is polyacetylene is actually a semiconductor due to Pile's distortion. Valence pi band is filled and the conduction pi star band is empty. Optical gap is about 1.7 electron volts, but that means that you must have a dimerization which is very large. Actually, the experimentally seen dimerization is about 7%, but if you should get an optical gap of 1.7 electron volts just based on non-interacting picture, then you require a dimerization of the order of about 15%. There is evidence for dipole orbital states below the Eg state, that is the lowest excitation is not a dipole allowed excitation but actually a 2-photon state, and you also have triplet states below the gap, and these have been actually studied in spectroscopy. And there is no evidence for mid-gap absorption in polyene radicals. People who have done careful studies know that there is no mid-gap absorption. If you look at electron spin resonance studies of these polyene radicals, then there is evidence for both positive and negative spin densities. If you have only non-interacting picture, then you will never have negative spin densities. You only have either positive spin densities or zero spin densities at alternate carbon sites. And there's also a very interesting system which is called symmetric cyanine dyes. And in this symmetric cyanine dyes, if you see the interior part here is very similar to polyenes, and so you would expect that as the number of carbon atoms in this particular system increases, then you should have an optical gap which should go closer to the optical gap of the polyacetylenes. But experimentally what you see is that if you see the optical gap of polyenes, they always extrapolate to a finite value, whereas the optical gap of symmetric cyanine dyes, as you increase the number of carbon atoms, extrapolates to 0. And this is a puzzle which is not clearly understood.
So however long is
Yeah, that's because see what happens is it's actually a trick. You have a n plus and n, so it is not in a half-filled system. So what you really have is one electron more than a half-filled system. So you have an incommensurate charge density wave, and if you have an incommensurate charge density wave, then you can slide it. If you slide it, it is optically allowed, but the energy required for sliding is 0. So that is the reason why it happens. So, but experimentally it was first seen, and it was quite a puzzle. So Huckel model actually goes into the single band tight binding model. So the drawbacks of the Huckel model are gives incorrect ordering of energy levels, fails to account for negative spin densities and gives wrong spin-spin correlations, fails to reproduce qualitative differences between closely related systems. It's mainly of pedagogical value because it was really fantastic. It explained aromaticity of benzene, 4n+2 rule, and so on and so forth. So, but it was not good for quantitative predictions. So you have to go into interacting pi electron models. So if you just look at just the Huckel orbitals, then you can have electron-electron repulsions, which can be overlap density repulsions. This is something the electron repulsion integrals are written by chemists as charge density repulsions. The charge density of electron 1 is in the overlap cloud of orbitals I and j. The charge density of electron 2 is in the overlap cloud of orbitals k and l, and there is a repulsion. And the Eij term is the one that hops electron from site j to site I of either spin, and this is how you write down the many particle Hamiltonian. This model requires further simplification if you really have to solve it. So the zero differential overlap approximation was invoked in chemistry, and what they said was that if you have these orbitals which are far apart, then the differential overlap of these orbitals is small, and so we can actually throw out electron repulsion integrals whenever I and j are not the same or k and l are not the same. So you would have an electron repulsion integral only which is a density electron repulsion integral, which is written as ijkl as ij kl delta ij delta kl. And this was called the Parzer-Pople model, or the PPP model, which the physicists call the extended Hubbard model. And this was introduced in the year 1953, and it is just a Hubbard model plus intersite interactions with some local chemical potentials thrown in. The Ono parameterization is what is preferred for the VRIJ, and this is a parameterization which reduces the electron-electron repulsion term to U when the distance between the orbitals is 0, and to E squared upon Rij when the sides are Rij tends to infinity. We have one more kind of parameterization which we will not worry about for now. So the model Hamiltonian that is used for modeling conjugated systems is very similar to the extended Hubbard models, except that you go into infinite range interactions, very long range interactions. So basically you have a transfer term between bonded sides, you have on-site electron repulsion, and then you have the density repulsion, and you can also have orbital energy, but if you are dealing with polyacetylenes, all the carbon atoms are identical, so you can choose the zero of energy so that the orbital energy vanishes. And Hubbard model is, of course, we only have a Huckel model plus on-site interaction, so this is the Hubbard model introduced in 1964. Well, people for a long time were trying to do exact diagonalization studies using the Hilbert space of PPP. Hamiltonian is finite for molecules. So, and also the PPP model conserves total S and MS. So the idea is to block diagonalize your Hamiltonian or factorize the Hilbert space using ideas like Rumour-Pauling valence bond basis. And only problem was that chemists were very skeptical about using Rumour-Pauling valence bond basis because it is non-orthogonal, although it is complete and linearly independent. But non-orthogonality only leads to non-symmetric matrices, which can be dealt with quite easily. And there are some recent developments which I will not go into, which can exploit the full spatial symmetry and the spin symmetry of these kinds of systems for any kind of a point group. Earlier it was only possible for abelian point groups, but now we can do it for any non-abelian point group as well. But here are some necessities and drawbacks of the exact diagonalization methods. As I said, that the Hilbert space keeps exploding. For example, if you have 14 electrons on 14 sides, the number of singlets is about 2.7 million. If you have 16 electrons on 16 sides, the number of singlets is 35 million. So it's exploding very rapidly. And so if you are dealing with polymers, you can only do for very few monomers, that is very few oligomers or very few unit cells, the calculations, and you cannot do extrapolations. So to do extrapolations, you require, the system size to be large enough so that the pi coherence length, it breaches the pi coherence length. But anyway, exact diagonalization methods always have provided a very good check on approximate methods. So in the chemistry literature, the approximate methods that were used were basically the restricted configuration interaction methods, which is the simplest is the Tamm-Dunkov approximation, which is actually singlet excitations. And then there have also been coupled cluster methods, which were kind of borrowed from nuclear physics. Then the quantum Monte Carlo methods, which are successful mainly for the ground state, but excited states I'm not so sure. And then there were renormalization group methods based on energy eigenvalues and the density matrix eigenvalues. So the one particle density matrices were constructed for these systems, and the eigenstates of the one particle density matrices were used as natural orbitals, and using these natural orbitals they constructed the many body states and did a configuration interaction calculation and found that the convergence for correlation energy was extremely good, but that was only using one particle density matrices, and it was something, a method that was pioneered initially by Loudon.
Is it related to density functional theory?
No. Density functional theory is extremely, is completely different. You give me a many body wave function, I can write down a one particle density matrix. by integrating out all the other coordinates, diagonalize the one particle density matrix.
And we go back to
I get the eigenstates and use eigenstates and construct my many body wave function as the one particle from these one particle states, and then keep doing this cycling it until you see that the correlation energy converges. Okay, so it's not a density functional theory in the sense that you are not expanding density in some Gaussian basis and so on and so forth.
so suppose one uses density function theory, will it be good or?
Density functional theory is basically an empirical Hartree-Fock method. Okay, so the problem is that often when you are dealing with spin systems, it's very difficult to get excited states. Is very difficult. You can get ground state properties and ground state geometries quite accurately from density functional methods, provided you are in the singlet state. If you are in a high speed state, it's not possible to get it. So, density matrix, the DMRG method, the density matrix renormalization group method, is slightly different in the sense that it uses the many particle density matrix and the eigenstates of the many particle density matrix to span the Fock space of the system, and using this basis you set up your Hamiltonian matrix. And I will not go into any details of that except have a slide on that. Basically what you do is, the way you implement it is, you iteratively build a large system starting from a small system. So you can start with a 4-spin system or something like that, obtain its ground state, and then from the ground state you have divide your system into a system block, consider your system to be a super block, divide it into an environment block and then a system block, and then integrate over the environment block to get the density matrix, and diagonalize the density matrix and obtain eigenstates. And those eigenstates, the dominant eigenstates, you keep for spanning the Fock space of the system block, and you can add extra sites to the system and keep and use these Fock space states for the system blocks, and rather Fock space states for new sites, and the density matrix eigenvectors for the system blocks, and then you can increase your system size. And basically it's extremely accurate for models such as the Hubbard model, Heisenberg spin chains, and for polymers also we have shown that it works very well. And of course, it's now a well-known technique, so I don't want to go into it. It was something that was introduced in 1992 by Steve White. And I just want to show the connection between the DMRG and the matrix product states. So if I look at the DMRG wave function, supposing I have a system block which is n-1 sites and the environment which is only n sites, the nth site is the environment, then the eigenstate of this particular system can be written as in terms of the density matrix eigenvector of this n-1 site problem, and then the last site, the nth site, the raw or the Fock space state. Now we can go back and write down the density matrix eigenvector of the n-1 size system in terms of density matrix eigenvectors of the n-2 state systems and then the spin of the n-1 site. So if you keep doing that, then you see that you will get an expansion, and then this expansion turns out to be just multiplication of matrices acting on the spin state sigma 1 to sigma n, which you can actually write down pictorially in terms of some kind of a matrix product states, which is actually contracting the tensors. So, but this is something that is useful for understanding the DMRG method and to know why it is size consistent in one-dimensional systems and so forth. And the reason why the DMRG method works is because of the area law and the entanglement entropy. That is, if I look at the this is entanglement entropy S, the entanglement entropy S depends upon the area between the system and the environment. And the DMRG cutoff scales as e to the power as, where S is the entanglement entropy. Now, in the case of one-dimensional systems, all that you have is just 2 points. So no matter how big the system is and the environment, when you break up the system into an environment block and the system block, then you will see that you only have 2 points, and so this entropy is going to be a constant in all the cases. So in all the cases, the entropy is going to be a constant, and so the DMRG cutoff M is going to be independent of the system size, and you will have a pretty good accuracy if you keep large enough M in doing a DMRG calculation. And of course, if you are close to any criticality even in one-dimensional systems, you will have logarithmic singularities, logarithmic corrections to the this thing, entanglement entropy, and there will be some problems. Now the point is that when you are dealing with polymer like the conjugated polymers, then what's happening is you are introducing, these are semiconducting systems, so you have got long range interactions. So when you have long range interactions, the system becomes essentially higher dimensional. So if the system becomes higher dimensional, then why is it that the DMRG method is extremely accurate even when you have PPP model, when you apply the PPP model? And this is something that we have studied recently, and what we find is the following. That is, here is a comparison of the entanglement entropy for a Hubbard model with U by T equal to 4 for a system, for systems varying between 6 and 16 sides. The system has been cut in the middle to calculate the entanglement entropy, and what you find is that the entanglement entropy, the PPP model and the Hubbard models are very, very similar. That's because the interaction terms are basically between diagonal interactions or the density interactions. So you don't have really hopping between the system and the environment block. So if you don't have hopping between the system and the environment block, then the states are not entangled. The basis states are no more entangled, and that is the reason why the DMRG method is extremely accurate for
grounded excited.
Yeah, these are grounded excited states. So I looked at singlet AG plus is the ground state, I have a triplet excited state, and then a 2-photon state in the optically excited state. So these are the states for which I have plotted the entanglement entropy. So the main challenge is that when you are dealing with conjugated polymers, you are not just interested in the ground state, but you are interested in certain excited states. And what are the important states in a polymer? The important states are the ground state, of course, and the lowest dipole excited state, which is the one that defines the optical gap, which is a 1 BU state. The lowest triplet state, particularly because nowadays people are interested in looking at issues such as singlet fission and multi-exciton generation for photovoltaic applications. And then the lowest 2-photon state, because that is the one that is going to govern whether a polymer is going to be luminescent or not. And then there are other states like the MAG plus and MBU minus states, which we'll not worry about. And the problem with unsymmetrized methods is there will be too many intruder states between desired ideal states, because the 1 BU state is typically about 2 to 3 electron volts above the ground state, and between the ground state and the 1 BU state you have many states like the triplet states and the quintet states and the 2A states and so forth, and you never know which state to target in order to get the 1 BU minus. So if you want to do that, you really have to introduce symmetry, and one of the things that we did in the DMRG technique is to introduce symmetries. The basic symmetries are basically the electron hole symmetry, and this is what you can look at, the transformation property of the electron hole symmetry. And what the electron hole symmetry does is, when you take the full space at half filling, then it is going to break it up into covalent space and the ionic space. And the ionic space is the one that does not have any of the covalent diagrams, which means diagrams or states in which each carbon site has just one electron, but this includes all those states. So you see, if you look at the interaction energies in this case, yeah, okay, thank you. The interaction energy in this case is zero interaction energy is also included, whereas in this case only interaction energies U, 2U and so forth are included. And the dipole operator connects these two spaces. So if you get the lowest energy state in this space, you get the ground state, the lowest energy space here, you get the optically allowed excited state. But you have to, it's an ever expanding system, and in the ever expanding system, you must be able to get consistently target the ionic space. And of course you have spin symmetries. Using the S squared conservation is very difficult. But on the other hand, when ms total is 0, you have H is invariant when all the spins are rotated about y-axis by pi. So that is equivalent to spin inversion. So you have what's called the spin inversion symmetry, and what the spin inversion symmetry does is actually divides the ms equal to 0 space into even space with a total spin s of 0, 2, 4 and an r space of total spin 1, 3 and 5, and so you can actually divide your space, and depending on this you can actually work with if you want to get a triplet, then you work in this space. If you want to get a singlet, you want to work in this space. So it's quite easy to actually implement this symmetry. And in fact, we have shown that this works well because by comparing with the results that we obtained for the Hubbard model, for U by D equal to 4, the exact optical gap is 1.2867 and we get 1.278. U by D equal to 6, it is 2.89 versus 2.895 and 2.893. And so the agreement is pretty good. And you also see that the 2AG excitation, the covalent excitation is going to 0 because these are going to be a spin wave excitation, the limit U by T being very large. And you can also see the dispersion is reducing as you go to large U by T equal to 6 here and U by T equal to 4. So basically this works.
For small molecules, you don't need dimerization.
No, dimerization, depending upon the molecular geometry, you can do the geometry optimization using any one of the techniques like in the quantum chemical techniques and then use that and put the transfer integrals according to that one and see.
At the moment it's without dimerization.
These are all without dimerization because I wanted to compare with exact Hubbard results, analytic results. So you don't have analytic results when you have dimerization. Yeah, these are for chains. Yeah, that's right. This is number of sites. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Which one? Spin inversion symmetry. Yeah. I mean, time reversal symmetry is the one that gives you a degeneration between plus half and minus half spin. Okay. So in this case, what you are doing is actually take the Hamiltonian, rotate the Hamiltonian by say the y-axis, the spin space by the by y-axis by an angle pi. The Hamiltonian remains invariant. That's equivalent to actually flipping all the down spins to up and up spins to down, and so the Hamiltonian remains invariant. This is something that now the spin inversion symmetry is something that Anders Sandvik also uses in his simulations. Yeah, I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the applications that we have gone through. One of the early questions in organic chemistry was very interesting. That is, we have benzene, which have equal bond lengths, and you have 135 hexatriene, which is very similar to that, but unequal bond length. So one of the questions that was asked in the 30s was, when you go to an infinite chain length, are you going to be having equal bond lengths or unequal bond lengths? And the answer came from Pals in 55, and he said unconditionally you will have dimerization in the system. And it was something that was the solution of the Huckel model, or the non-interactive model, was provided by Salem and Langett-Higgins, and they showed that the electronic energy stabilization goes as del squared ln modulus delta, where delta is the dimerization, whereas the stabilization of the lattice energy goes as half k delta squared. And because you have the ln delta term, so no matter how strong the lattice stiffness is, you will always have a delta which is non-zero, for which the electronic energy is going to be larger. The gain in electronic energy will be larger. Well, we wanted to look at another related system, which is actually polyacenes. In the case of polyacenes, it is almost like the polyene chain. You see on the top you have one polyene chain, bottom you have another polyene chain, except that it is a ladder system with alternate rungs missing. This can have two kinds of dimerizations. One is called the cis and the other is called the trans. Now, this is interesting because the dimerization has a symmetry which is of the S type, whereas the bands at which there is degeneracy are of the type A and S at the zone edges. Now the issue is in the non-interacting picture you cannot say what happens because the matrix element is 0. So what happens in the interacting picture? So we studied this for the long range model. For this we had to build up the polyacene molecules starting from a small system, and how do you build up polymers which have topology which is very different from the one-dimensional topology. And so that we could do by adding sites at different sites. And you see, for example, I start with a 4-membered ring, add 2 new sites, go to a 6-membered ring, add 2, get an 8-membered ring. When I add the next 2 sites, then I'll make it into a 2, 5, 6-membered rings, and so on and so forth. So it was possible to do this. In fact, this is the technique now being used by DMRG community for dealing with cyclic boundary conditions, because if you want to deal with systems with cyclic boundary conditions, the DMRG technique was not very accurate, but now the accuracy is improved because of this kind of adding of the sites. And you see that the electronic energy gain goes quadratically with dimerization. So which means that delta E is going as delta squared. So the electronic energy gain is del squared, and so the strain energy required is also del squared. So the instability in case of poly ACs is basically a conditional instability. That is, depending upon the force constant or the stiffness of the lattice, you will have distortion or no distortion. And we also did the bond-bond correlation function calculations and looked at the structure factors, and we see that the structure factor peaking at Q equal to 0, showing that there will not be distortion in this system. Another interesting, yeah.
If you assume finite masses for the carbon atom, then quantum fluctuations will play a role. And I remember people, in the case of Higgs instability, there is a critical parameter
Okay.
above which quantum fluctuation is destroyed.
Yeah.
So like in benzene,
Yeah. So, but
you must have a similar thing, like you make it bigger and bigger. Beyond some point, it will be files dimerized. Below that, it won't be there.
The fluctuations are not the calculations.
I'm saying in
Yeah.
reality, in molecule.
I'm not so sure whether in the molecules it becomes so important. I mean, I have not thought about it, so I cannot tell you definitive answer. No, annealing rings are different in the sense that here I'm looking at benzene rings going together. Annealing rings, what you are saying is that as you go to larger and larger sizes, the quantum fluctuations could probably kill the pile's instability. Is that what you are saying?
Right. As it becomes bigger, the quantum fluctuation becomes smaller, and the dimerization.
No, dimerization sets in. In a way you are right, because what happens is that if you look at the two ground states, the pile state with the, then we must have, as you keep increasing the number of bonds, then in order to switch over from all the double bonds to the left to all the double bonds to the right, then you have to create more and more, doubly occupied sites. So which means that the barrier becomes very large and infinite, and then you get stuck in one of them. Okay, so it does happen. But these actually, the finite calculations do give you a fairly accurate picture of what's happening in these systems.
But you assume that the masses are basically.
Yeah. So I mean, it's basically no dynamics of the lattices included. Okay. Okay. Now, one of the things that we were interested in was looking at systems which show actually in the organic photovoltaics, people want to generate more excitons with just one photon. So what they want to do is one photon is going to take you from the singlet excited state, and supposing the singlet excited state can dissociate into two triplet excited states, then you will be able to create two electron hole pairs, and so the efficiency goes up. Now, for this to happen, the triplet exciton energy must be less than one half of the singlet exciton energy, and we wanted to look at systems which will show that kind of behavior. Poly ACs is one such systems where we have shown that the triplet exciton energy is pretty low, but we wanted to see whether we could go to larger systems, to different kinds of systems. So we wanted to look at what are called fused azulenes. These are very much, instead of two 6-member rings, you have a 5-member ring and a 7-member ring and a 5-member ring being together and fused together. So this particular single unit is called azulene, and these are called polyazulene systems. So the fused azulene systems, you have frustration within the ring. So when you have frustration, usually the high spin states have a lower energy, because the spin excitations will be not very different from the ground state, and so the energy has to be lower. So we wanted to look at that, and we also know that if you look at the Hugel 4n plus 2 rule, which says that any system which has got 4n plus 2 electrons, any ring system is going to be, planar ring system is going to be stable. So here you have 7 electrons in this ring and 5 electrons in that ring. So you prefer to donate 1 electron there, so that you have 6 electrons on each side. And so you have the 4n plus 2 rule, which would make it 7-member ring as positive and 5-member ring as negative. So you should be able to have some kind of a dipole moment in this molecule. In fact, azulene is a molecule which has got a dipole moment, even though it's purely carbon system. Okay, the framework is purely carbon system. So we wanted to study this system, and we looked at the excitation in spin gaps. So when we looked at the spin gaps, this This one corresponds to the gap between ms1 and ms0, and delta 2, this curve corresponds to ms equal to 2 and ms equal to 0, and this one corresponds to ms equal to 3 and ms equal to 0. So what we see is very interesting. That is, for smaller azulene system, N is the number of azulenes in the fused azulene. For smaller azulene systems, you have a single ground state because the triplet state is higher in energy. And as you come to about 5 fused azulene systems, the triplet becomes the ground state. Now we wanted to look at the quintet state. The quintet state is showing a slope which is very sharp, and it looks like the quintet becomes the ground state when you go to larger systems like 12 fused azulenes or so. And if you go to much larger ones, then the septet, the S equal to 3 system, ground state, S equal to 3 state will become the ground state. So it looks like this system is going to show ferromagnetism when you go to infinite chain length. So this is what I have said, that ground state for oligomers with n greater than 5 is triplet, n less than 5 is singlet, and S equal to 2 for systems more than relevant azulene units, and it appears that the ferromagnetic ground state will result. Now I also looked at the charge densities, and the charge densities show that the 7-member ring is positively charged and the 5-member ring is negatively charged, and the amplitude of this charge density does not change even when I go to very large systems. So this is about 20 ring system is what I have gone to. So it looks like there is going to be both ferroelectricity and ferromagnetism in this system. So this will be an example of organic multiferroic for the first time, and so and my organic chemistry friends tell me that it is possible to synthesize a system like that. I think I will probably skip on now some of the porphyrins and other results, but I'll go into a slightly different thing, that is, we wanted to look at the dynamic response functions using DMRG. Usually the commonly used technique in physics is to obtain I omega using the Lanczos technique. So it's basically a continued fraction and then you can calculate it, the dynamic response for any frequency omega. In the chemistry community, what is preferred is sum over state. So you explicitly compute the excited states and the transition dipoles, and then you sum over all these transition dipoles with a weight factor, which is the excitation energy. So, but the Lanczos technique has inherent truncation dependent on the small matrix that you have actually constructed. SOS techniques limits the number of excitations. So we went into another technique which we call the correction vector technique, which avoids these truncation problems, and that was done using setting up a hierarchy of equations. So basically you solve Green's function phi1 omega by setting up this equation. So this is a linear algebraic equation which is inhomogeneous, and if you solve for phi1, then you will see that you can get I omega as just a matrix element of the operator O between the ground state and your response function or the correction vector, and it's quite easy to solve these linear algebraic equations, even though the number of equations that you are going to deal with will be in the order of many millions. Yeah?
Where is the interaction here? Sorry.
Huh? The interaction comes in the Hamiltonian. Full Hamiltonian is there. So, but you have to use symmetry, otherwise you will have singularities and there will be problems. So if you want to look at non-linear optic coefficients, you can define the hierarchy of equations, like for example the second order response in terms of first order response, and you can get the third harmonic generation coefficient using this kind of matrix elements. Okay, just matrix element between phi1 and phi2 involving mu, then you can get the third harmonic generation coefficient. And what we showed was we can actually do this calculation using the density matrix renormalization group technique, because we can use a DMRG technique, use a matrix which is a DMRG matrix, and do these calculations, and they turn out to be extremely accurate. So accurate that now most of the people in the DMRG community now rely on correction vector technique for calculating Kondo resonances and such things. We applied it to a different class of molecules which are what are called triphenyl triphenyl amines, tritolulyl amines. These are tritolulyl amines, and then you can have different kinds of structures of this kind, and then we looked at some of the nonlinear optic coefficients of these things, and you will see that the second harmonic generation coefficients of these systems are pretty huge, because we are interested in looking at polymers which show large nonlinear optic response. But more recently we were also interested in looking at real-time dynamics. Real-time dynamics is important if you want to understand processes like spin charge separation in PPP models, or you want to study electron-hole recombination, which is important for organic light-emitting diodes, because there is one of the basic electronic processes that take place in the device. And other things like fluorescent resonant energy transfer, because you are exciting one molecule, the excitation goes from one molecule to the other, and you want to study that. And to study these things, you really have to do a wave packet dynamics. You build an initial wave packet size 0, and then use a time-dependent Schrodinger equation to propagate it. If you want to use a DMRG technique for doing this, there is a problem. That is, if this is the total Hilbert space of the problem, then the DMRG Hilbert space is like this, and as you evolve beyond a certain time, your wave packet goes away from the DMRG Hilbert space, so it becomes extremely inaccurate. So you have to keep adapting the Hilbert space as you keep evolving the wave packet. So at every time you have to keep changing the DMRG Hilbert space. It's called the adaptive time DMRG technique. And that is quite time consuming, the way it has been done in by different groups. So what we wanted to do was a slightly different kind of adaptive time dependent DMRG, which we call the double time window targeting technique, in which what we do is we average the density matrix over two time windows, and use the density matrix eigenvectors corresponding to this average density matrix, and use that space to actually propagate over one window, and then when we go to the next window we again do the same thing. And this we have found to be extremely fast and also very accurate, because we can compare it against the other techniques as well as the exact diagonalization results for chains of up to about 16 sites. And using this, we looked at charge and spin transport in PPP chains, which are basically the polyacetylene chains. And you see that as you increase the number of the chain length, then slowly the charge is taking more time to go from one end to the other, because I have put the charge at the first site, and then I'm looking at how much time it takes for the charge to go to the end of the chain. And you see that the first peak is coming going up, so you can actually define a velocity, and the spin is going much more slowly. So we do see that spin charge separation in the PPP models, which is actually cannot be reproduced very easily by the Hubbard model, because it's very difficult to have an effective view which gives you the same excitation gaps and the spin charge separation. So I would like to summarize, because I think my time is going to be almost up. I'll leave some time for questions. So molecular electronic materials based on conjugated organics are really strongly correlated systems. Electron states in these systems are modeled by long-range interactive models like the PPP model. We can go into probably multi-band models if necessary, like if you are dealing with diacetylenes and so forth. The entanglement entropy of eigenstates of PPP chains are comparable to those of Hubbard models. That is why DMRG method is best suited for solving these models. And the DMRG method is extended to target desired excited states, obtain frequency-dependent linear and nonlinear responses. There is also efficient real-time DMRG algorithm has been developed for wave packet dynamics. So basically, although DMRG technique was developed in the physics community for dealing with spin chains and the Hubbard chains and so forth, I find that this is ideally suited for dealing with conjugated organic polymers and can be used for obtaining various different properties of these kinds of systems. Thank you very much. Okay, because the DMRG eigenstate or the DMRG eigenstate that you get, you can show can actually be written as a matrix product state. There's a new interpretation.
Okay, so also
want to go into different kinds of systems and have different ansatz, like what they call the Mera ansatz for minimally entangled renormalization ansatz, as well as the PEPs and so forth. Different kinds of wave functions people set up for for dealing with two-dimensional lattices, but not very successful.
So one doesn't use actually these in computations?
No.
Okay.
DMRG is the best way of doing a matrix product state calculation.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
In ethylene, transition metal doped ethylene. This is a totally different topic, so I'm going to stick my neck out and say it anyway. It applies to polyacetylene also. Density functional theory calculations with isolated transition metal atoms sitting on carbon atoms show that you can get a large number of hydrogen molecules absorbed on these chains. And I think these are fairly believable, but I think going forward, there's a push by Ashcroft in particular that you can use this technique to reach metallic hydrogen. So you're getting densities of hydrogen which are much, much larger than what you can get by pure physical compression. So I don't know, I mean, maybe the DMRG could help figure out when you're going to get this metallic state.
Okay. One of the molecular systems is rather difficult because in the true molecular system, you have the interactions introduce transfer integrals, or the interactions lead to transfer of electron from one orbital to the other, no matter where they are located. Okay, so which means that you have off-diagonal long-range interactions, not just diagonal long-range interactions. And when you have off-diagonal long-range interactions, then your entanglement entropy is going to be pretty large. And so people have not been very successful in using DMRG to study molecules from the ab initio point of view, although there have been attempts to do that. Okay, and for the same reason you cannot do a DMRG calculation in the K space, you have to do it in the real space. Okay, and then as far as the DFT calculation of the transition metal doped ethylenes is concerned, like I said, the DFT calculations are pretty good for the ground state, and particularly when you don't worry about space-plane interactions. But for example, if you want to look at magnetic molecules, in molecular magnetism, so interaction between transition metal ions, they have found that there are about 26 different functionals people have used, and each functional gives you a different answer. So you never know which is going to be the spin of the ground state. Okay, so this is something that is rather difficult to kind of comprehend, and that's the reason why I said. And also, for example, unless you use some kind of constrained DFT, which is also rather cumbersome, and I don't know how accurate it is, you cannot get the spin of a particular site to be conserved. So for example, if I got 2 Fe3 plus and the total spin, you have spin 5 by 2 and the total spin is 0, if you do a calculation, you must be making sure that each Fe3 plus is spin 5 by 2, and that is rather difficult. So that is what I was trying to say, that and you cannot get excited state, and although people say that using time-dependent density functional theory you can get excited states, I feel that the question of functionals still exists even in time-dependent density functional theories.
Other question?
Expect fully spin polarized state or ground state or partially, in other words, the total spin.
The total spin is going to be,
macroscopic.
Macroscopic. It has to become macroscopic. But I try to look at the spin densities. Spin densities are ETBT at each site. So I don't know how exactly the spin densities are going to be oriented.
I see.
So I mean, there are questions that I cannot answer. But nonetheless, it looks to me like the high spin state is going to be a ground state. Higher and higher spin states become the ground state, and also the dipoles get ordered. So it is looking like a multiferroic. Thank you. It is not like flat band ferromagnetism, because I also looked at the one particle spectrum. You don't have large degeneracies, and you don't have things like non-disjoint degenerate molecular orbitals which are partially occupied. You don't have those issues.
Let's thank Professor Ramashesha and all the others.